How much of an influence did Garfield's affiliation and faith with the Disciples of Christ, the Stone-Campbell movement,
Yes,
affect his life and career?
tremendous. In the spark that his participation, the Disciples of Christ in the Stone-Campbell movement, it came at the beginning of his real development into an adult. The Disciples of Christ, for I'm sure your listeners know more than the average audience, but they were a uniquely decentralized movement. They still are today. And in the Western Reserve of Ohio, the disciples were a very big regional influence. The disciples didn't really have a formal ecclesiastic hierarchy. They believe very much in we speak where the Bible speaks and we are silent where it is silent. It was this very empowering movement that aligned very well with this corner of Ohio that was of New England descent. It was in a pretty rough geographically part of the nation by then. It's today the Western Reserve is the Cleveland area, so let's just say it's been developed a little bit. But Garfield's encounter with the disciple orthodoxy, it was this catalyst for his intellectual creativity. He wrote in his diary entry after accepting baptism into the movement, he wrote of seeing how much beauty of God is set forth even in the flower, and he's writing that during botanical lessons. So it's giving him this intellectual fire that he's applying to his secular studies. It's also very important for him as a speaker, because as Garfield went through the rest of his education, he ended up leaving the reserve to go to Williams College in Massachusetts. The disciple movement put a lot of theological authority, and it trusted members of the laity to act as clergy. So a young Garfield was able to preach. He was able to be a traveling preacher, kind of in a part-time setting. And you can't look at how his rhetoric develops for the rest of his life without seeing the divine, the willingness of him to blend divine language and divine imagery with the civic religion of America. He was he was one of the most impressive speakers of that era. And he was somebody who, even when he was very young, when he was just fresh off the battlefield into the halls of Congress, mid-Civil War, he was very willing to imbue his radical Republican philosophy, political philosophy, with religious imagery. He viewed the Civil War as God's will, interestingly enough. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but his disciple, faith was crucial to him. And he, of course, got it from his mother. His mom, Eliza, was somebody who converted to the disciple movement after losses in the family. And then, interestingly enough, and I'll end this thought here, when Garfield was elected to the presidency, he was the first disciple of Christ to be elected to the presidency. He was not the last, and I won't go down that rabbit hole either.
Two
But
others.
yeah, there were two others. That's right. And but he wrote to, I believe it was Burke Hinsdale, his very good, almost lifelong friend, and it hurt Hinsdale being a fellow disciple. And Garfield wrote something along the lines of, "We must not make too big of a deal of this. If we want to normalize a member of our movement getting to this office, the key is to not celebrate it. That is how you normalize these things." So it was an interesting little meditation on gaining access by one type group of Americans to a new hall of power. And it was an interesting spearhead there. Not many people would have looked at James Garfield and thought, a pathbreaker for a different sect of American, but he was, at least in that case.
And there is a story in the book about him putting off a cabinet meeting to go to church.
Yes. He went to the former disciple church in DC. It doesn't stand anymore, unfortunately. I believe it was on, I think, Rhode Island Avenue. There now, of course, you have the National City Christian Church, which is a very different structure. But the disciple church back in Garfield's time was described by a reporter who was attending the worship while Garfield was president. This reporter described this church as a Campbellite shanty because it was such a humble building, and people were saying it is unworthy of a president's worship, this thing. But there's this diary entry, and you've read the book. Garfield, he puts off a cabinet meeting, goes to the worship, takes his mother along, and he writes of the attendance of this church skyrocketing now that he's president. And he writes of the tragedy of to see so many people, unauthentically attending worship just by the accident, as he puts it, of one of its members being given power. So he's annoyed by the intrusions that his elevation to the office has now put upon not only his personal life, but his religious one as well.
In that way, he was kind of ahead of his time because a lot of presidents are reluctant to attend church now because they're going to be the main attraction, not God.
Yes, they are. And also, presidents that really spend too much time dwelling upon theology, especially these days, the benefits are there's a ceiling to those, I'd argue. And the downside is maybe there's less of a floor than you'd think. Garfield and his interactions with the public, not just in a religious context with him being a disciple, but also just his interactions with the public in general, he was ahead of his time in ways both inspiring and tragic, because as Garfield's life, for as inspiring as it was and as path-breaking as it was also, of course, ended tragically. He was the second president to be assassinated, and he was assassinated, he was shot essentially 3 months into his term. He died 80 days after that. But he was the last of our presidents who were really able to interact freely with the public. Back in those days, and this was actually a very important principle of early American government, there was a lot of argument that the president and our leaders should be accessible to the average citizen. There shouldn't be a barrier between the highest executive in the land and the common American. That was seen as something that was important to Republican small r government. And in the aftermath of the shooting, because one of the reasons somebody was able to shoot him at all was because of this lack of barrier, there was an editorial that I cite in the book, and it talks about, I think it was in the New York Times or the New York Tribune, but it talks about how now the president is going to have to be a prisoner of customs, because he will need to be afraid in every crowd of a hidden gun or a knife. And so that his death ended up being when there was this calloused layer of distance began to be put between our elected leaders and the common people because of what that lowest common denominator of American might do.